I'm older now than I ever imagined I would be when I first unlocked that shed in my 40s. The days are quieter. I tend the garden. I fix small things that don't matter much. People assume I enjoy the rest, and in many ways I do. But rest is not the same as resolution. The business still exists. It has grown in ways I no longer track. Occasionally, I see its name mentioned somewhere, or hear a passing comment about an expansion or a change in direction. I am not consulted. I am not informed. My connection to it has settled into something historical. I am part of the origin story, not the present tense. There was a time when I thought I might be invited back in some capacity. An advisory role, a seat at the table, something that acknowledged experience rather than control. That invitation never came. Not because anyone was cruel enough to deny it, but because there was no need. The systems were already in place. The narrative was already complete. Founders are useful when something is being built. Once it stands on its own, they become optional. I have learned that betrayal does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as consideration. It wears the language of efficiency and care. It thanks you while it replaces you. By the time you recognize it, there's nothing left to argue about. Everything has already been decided, signed, and implemented. I don't speak of this with bitterness. That surprises some people. But bitterness requires an enemy, and I have none. The people involved believe they did the right thing. In many ways, perhaps they did. The business survived. It even improved. That was always the goal. I simply misunderstood my place in that outcome. If I regret anything, it is not the trust. I would rather have trusted and lost my position than guarded it and lost my family. What I regret is not recognizing that stepping back is rarely neutral. It creates space, and space invites occupation. Once filled, it is almost never returned. I tell this story not as a warning, but as a record. Things can be taken without being seized. People can be removed without being dismissed. A life's work can continue without its creator, and do so smoothly enough that no one questions how it happened. I built something from nothing. I gave it everything I had, and when the time came, it moved on without me, quietly and completely. There was no confrontation, no closure, just a gradual understanding that my role had ended long before I stopped showing up. By the time I turned 60, delegation had become the language everyone used around me. It was spoken gently, with reassurance built into every sentence. You shouldn't have to worry about this anymore. We'll take that off your plate. Focus on the parts you enjoy. None of it sounded threatening. In fact, it sounded like care. I began handing over small things deliberately. Not because I was incapable, but because I believed a business should not depend entirely on one person. I had always said that. I let my son handle supplier negotiations for a trial period. I asked my daughter to prepare reports instead of me staying late to do them. When they made changes, they explained them carefully, always referencing efficiency, modern standards, or advice they had picked up elsewhere. I listened. I agreed more often than I challenged. The praise increased as the responsibility shifted. I was thanked in meetings I attended, complimented in front of staff. Customers were told stories about the early days, about my work ethic, about sacrifices I had made. I noticed that these stories were usually told when I was present, and decisions were usually discussed when I was not. At the time, I thought that was coincidence. I had always trusted coincidence. "Let us handle this," became a familiar phrase. It was said with smiles, sometimes with a hand on my shoulder. When I hesitated, someone would remind me of a recent doctor's appointment or a long week I had endured. They weren't wrong. I was tired. I had earned the right to be tired. I began leaving earlier some days. I took a proper lunch now and then. The business continued without disruption, which I took as confirmation that I had done things correctly. I still signed off on major decisions, or so I thought. Documents were prepared before they reached me, neat and complete, with explanations attached. I rarely disagreed. When I did, The room would grow quiet for a moment before someone suggested an alternative approach that achieved the same outcome without requiring my involvement. It seemed reasonable. Everything seemed reasonable when presented calmly. I noticed changes in the way information reached me. Conversations I once had directly were now summarized later. Emails were forwarded instead of copied. Staff began approaching my children first, even when I was present. When I asked a question, it was answered politely, sometimes with a slight delay, as though checking was required. I told myself this was the price of stepping back. You couldn't have rest and control at the same time. That was a trade I had accepted. At home, the business was discussed less with me and more around me. I would hear names, plans, figures spoken as shared knowledge that no longer needed explanation. When I asked for detail, it was provided willingly, but briefly. I began to feel like a guest in conversations that once lived entirely in my head. Still, there was no hostility, no raised voices, only a gentle momentum carrying things forward. What I did not understand then was how delegation hardens, how temporary arrangements become permanent through repetition, how authority fades not through conflict, but through absence. Each time I stepped aside willingly, a space opened that someone else filled. Each time I agreed to be less involved, the idea of me being central became slightly less true. I was still respected. I was still included. But inclusion had begun to replace leadership, and respect had begun to replace authority. I didn't resist because there was nothing obvious to resist. No argument, no ultimatum. Just a steady movement that felt, at the time, like progress. The paperwork changed before anything else did. It always does. At first, it was just formatting. New letterheads, updated templates, a different tone in the language. Then came the routing. Documents that once landed on my desk now passed through other hands first. They arrived with notes attached, recommendations already formed. I was asked to review rather than decide. Meetings began to happen without me, though never, at first, in a way that felt deliberate. A supplier meeting scheduled on a day I was away. A planning session held last minute when I had already left for the afternoon. I was briefed afterward, efficiently and calmly, as though the important part was that I knew, not that I had been there. When I mentioned it, someone would apologize and assure me it wasn't intentional. I believed them. I had no reason not to. My signature still appeared on documents, but less often. Some items no longer required it. Others were approved under revised authority limits I had apparently agreed to, though I couldn't remember when. When I asked, I was shown emails, minutes, attachments. Everything was documented. Everything was correct. I began to feel foolish for questioning processes that were clearly written down. It was hard to argue with a paper trail that bore my name. Access shifted quietly. I noticed one morning that I could no longer see certain financial reports without requesting them. It was explained as a software change, a permissions update to reduce clutter. "You don't need all of that anymore," my daughter said kindly. "We'll pull anything relevant for you." The word relevant did a lot of work in that sentence. I let it pass. I stopped being the default contact without being told I had stopped. Calls were redirected, messages answered before they reached me. Staff would say, "We've already run that past your son," as though that settled the matter. When I corrected them, reminding them I was still involved, they apologized sincerely and adjusted for a while. Then the pattern returned. Habits are difficult to undo once they feel efficient. There were meetings where my name was invoked more than my presence was required. "He built this," someone would say. "We want to honor that." I would nod, grateful and uneasy in equal measure. Decisions were framed as protecting my legacy, my health, my peace of mind. To object felt ungrateful. To insist on involvement felt like clinging. I had spent my life avoiding that sort of behavior. I was proud of my practicality. I began to realize that nothing required my approval unless it was ceremonial. My attendance was welcomed, but not necessary. My opinion was heard, but not decisive. When I asked direct questions about direction or risk, answers came back carefully managed, as though there were considerations I no longer needed to worry about. It wasn't said outright. It didn't have to be. The most unsettling part was how normal it all appeared. There was no tension in the office, no visible struggle. The business ran smoothly. Invoices went out. Contracts were renewed. Staff seemed confident. On the surface, everything suggested success. And yet, I found myself learning about changes after they had already taken effect. Policies adjusted, relationships redefined, all done properly, all justified, all irreversible by the time I became aware of them. I was still called the founder, still thanked, still consulted occasionally. But somewhere between one meeting and the next, the center had moved. Authority had not been taken from me. It had simply been reassigned, one document, one decision, one absence at a time. I became aware of decisions the way one becomes aware of weather changes after the fact. A new supplier relationship would be mentioned in passing. A staffing change would already be in place when I arrived. When I asked when it had been decided, I was told it came out of a discussion the previous week, or a meeting I hadn't been part of. There was always an explanation, and it was always reasonable. My role shifted into something symbolic without anyone naming it. I was invited to attend, but not expected to contribute. When I did speak, the room listened politely, then moved on. My suggestions were acknowledged, sometimes even praised, but rarely acted on. I told myself that was progress, that the business no longer needed me to function day to day. That had been the goal, hadn't it? What unsettled me was not exclusion, but timing. I was told about things just late enough that questioning them would cause disruption. Contracts already signed, notices already sent, staff already informed. Reversing anything would mean embarrassment, cost, or confusion. I had spent my life avoiding those outcomes. I wasn't about to start creating them in my later years. My access narrowed further. Calendar invitations stopped arriving unless my presence served a clear purpose. Financial summaries became shorter, less detailed. I was given outcomes instead of context. When I asked for more, I was assured everything was under control. "You don't need to carry this anymore," my wife said one evening, and I realized she believed it. She believed I had already stepped away. The office itself began to feel unfamiliar. Furniture moved. Systems changed. Conversations happened at a pace I struggled to follow, not because I couldn't understand, but because I hadn't been part of the buildup. Decisions have a momentum when you're involved early. When you're not, they arrive fully formed, resistant to influence. I noticed staff hesitating before speaking to me, as though unsure of protocol. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others spoke warmly, nostalgically, as if addressing someone retired. It was never unkind. That was the hardest part. There was no malice to point at, only adjustment. My name remained on the documents that mattered publicly, on the signage, on the website, in introductions. "This is his business," people would say, gesturing toward me. Inside, however, the channels of authority had rerouted. Decisions flowed around me, not through me. I had become a reference point rather than a participant. There was a day I realized I could stop coming in and nothing would change. The thought didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, while watching a meeting unfold that required none of my input. I sat there, nodded at the appropriate moments, and understood that my presence was no longer operational. It was ceremonial. I didn't confront anyone. There was nothing to confront. No single act, no sharp line. Just a sequence of polite exclusions that, taken together, formed a complete removal. I had not been fired. I had been phased out, carefully, considerately, completely. I stopped going in every day shortly after that. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a few mornings off, a longer weekend. I waited to see if anyone would call with a question that only I could answer. They didn't. When messages did come, they were updates, not requests. Information, not consultation. The business continued exactly as it had the week before. Staff arrived on time. Work went out the door. Clients were serviced. There was no disruption that required my return. That was when I understood the process was complete. Not because I was no longer needed, but because the structure had been designed so that I would never be needed again. I came in one afternoon to clear out some old files. No one objected. In fact, several people stopped to thank me for everything I had done. They spoke warmly, sincerely. One of them said the place wouldn't exist without me. Another said they hoped to still see me around. I nodded, smiled, said the appropriate things. It all sounded like a farewell, even though no one called it that. At home, the days stretched. I found myself listening for the phone out of habit. I still thought in terms of schedules and deadlines. I still woke early. The difference was that nothing followed. The silence was not an accident. It was the result of a system that no longer routed anything to me. I had been removed not just from decision-making, but from relevance. There was no final conversation, no meeting where terms were explained, no document that said I was finished. I remained officially associated, publicly acknowledged, privately absent. The arrangement allowed everyone to feel comfortable. They could say they had not pushed me out. I could say I had stepped back. The truth sat quietly between those statements. I considered briefly making noise, demanding clarity, insisting on formal recognition of what had happened. But to what end? The business was healthy. The people involved were my family. There was no version of confrontation that would return authority without causing damage I no longer had the energy to manage. I had spent my life building something stable. I wasn't going to be the one to destabilize it at the end. What remained was a strange kind of emptiness. Not grief, exactly. More an absence of weight where something heavy had always been. I had given the business my best years. It had shaped my days, my relationships, my sense of usefulness. When it moved on without me, it did so politely, efficiently, and without pause. People still ask me about it sometimes. They speak as though it's still mine. I let them. Correcting them would require explanation, and explanation would require revisiting something I've already lived through. I built the business. I no longer belong to it. Both statements are true. In the end, there was no explosion. No betrayal that could be pointed to in a single sentence. Only a gradual narrowing, a quiet redirection, and a silence that made its intentions clear. When I finally stepped away completely, no one noticed. And that, more than anything else, told me how thoroughly the work had been done. I am older now than I ever imagined I would be when I first unlocked that shed in my 40s. The days are quieter. I tend the garden. I fix small things that don't matter much. People assume I enjoy the rest, and in many ways I do. But rest is not the same as resolution. The business still exists. It has grown in ways I no longer track. Occasionally, I see its name mentioned somewhere, or hear a passing comment about an expansion or a change in direction. I am not consulted. I am not informed. My connection to it has settled into something historical. I am part of the origin story, not the present tense. There was a time when I thought I might be invited back in some capacity. An advisory role, a seat at the table, something that acknowledged experience rather than control. That invitation never came. Not because anyone was cruel enough to deny it, but because there was no need. The systems were already in place. The narrative was already complete. Founders are useful when something is being built. Once it stands on its own, they become optional. I have learned that betrayal does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as consideration. It wears the language of efficiency and care. It thanks you while it replaces you. By the time you recognize it, there is nothing left to argue about. Everything has already been decided, signed, and implemented. I don't speak of this with bitterness. That surprises some people. But bitterness requires an enemy, and I have none. The people involved believe they did the right thing. In many ways, perhaps they did. The business survived. It even improved. That was always the goal. I simply misunderstood my place in that outcome. If I regret anything, it is not the trust. I would rather have trusted and lost my position than guarded it and lost my family. What I regret is not recognizing that stepping back is rarely neutral. It creates space, and space invites occupation. Once filled, it is almost never returned. I tell this story not as a warning, but as a record. Things can be taken without being seized. People can be removed without being dismissed. A life's work can continue without its creator, and do so smoothly enough that no one questions how it happened. I built something from nothing. I gave it everything I had, and when the time came, it moved on without me, quietly and completely. There was no confrontation, no closure, just a gradual understanding that my role had ended long before I stopped showing up.